You are in the control room of U-Boat 527. It is July 10th, 1943, North Atlantic. You have been submerged for 6 hours, evading a British destroyer that has been hunting you since dawn. 48 men are crammed into this steel tube, 220 feet long, 20 feet wide. The air is thick and hot. It smells of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and fear. You can hear the destroyer's screws above you. Thump, 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 thump. Slow, methodical. The hydrophone operator whispers that the destroyer is turning, coming back for another pass. And then you hear it. The splashes. 5 of them in quick succession. Depth charges hitting the water above you. You have maybe 15 seconds before they reach your depth and detonate. The captain orders hard left rudder. Emergency dive to 200 meters. But you know it might not matter, because if just one of those depth charges explodes within 20 feet of your hull, this submarine becomes your coffin. And even if they miss, even if you survive this attack, there will be another. And another. The destroyer has over 100 depth charges. You have nowhere to run, no way to fight back. You can only dive deeper, go silent, and pray that the ocean is large enough to hide you. This is what really happened inside a sinking U-boat during World War II. Not the sanitized version from movies. The real version. The terror. The helplessness. The knowledge that you are trapped in a steel tube hundreds of feet underwater, while someone above is trying to crush you like an insect. Let me tell you what it was truly like to be a U-boat crewman facing death in the depths. First, understand the numbers. Germany built 1,162 U-boats during World War II. 785 were lost. Out of approximately 39,000 men who served in U-boats, 28,000 died. That is a casualty rate of 72%. 7 out of every 10 U-boat crewmen never came home. This makes U-boat service the most dangerous military assignment of the entire war. More dangerous than bomber crews. More dangerous than infantry on the Eastern Front. More dangerous than anything. And most of those deaths happened inside sinking submarines. Trapped, drowning, crushed by water pressure, or killed by the explosion itself. Quick, if they were lucky. Slow and terrifying, if they were not. A Type 7C U-boat, the most common variant, had a crew of 44 to 52 men, depending on the mission. They lived in a space barely larger than a city bus. The pressure hull was made of steel 1 inch thick, strong enough to dive to 230 meters, the official maximum depth. The collapse depth, where the hull would fail catastrophically, was estimated at 250 to 295 meters. Though some boats went deeper and survived, and some collapsed at shallower depths when damaged. Inside this steel tube, men worked 12-hour shifts. When off duty, they slept in bunks stacked 3 high, so narrow you could barely turn over. The lucky ones had bunks. Junior ratings slept on the deck, on the floor between equipment, anywhere they could find space. There was no privacy, no escape, no room to move. 48 men sharing 2 tiny toilets. 1 shower that was often used for food storage because space was more valuable than hygiene. The smell was indescribable. Diesel fuel permeated everything. Your clothes, your skin, your hair. Mix that with the smell of 48 unwashed men, spoiled food, backed-up toilets, and the chemicals from the batteries. Veterans said you could smell a U-boat crew from across the street when they came ashore. The smell never completely washed out. But worse than the smell was the fear. Because you knew the statistics. You knew that 7 out of 10 U-boat crews died. You knew that every time you left port, you might not come back. and you knew that if your boat was sunk, your chances of survival were almost zero. U-boats did not carry life rafts. There was no room. If you were on the surface when hit, you might have time to abandon ship. If you were submerged, you would die inside the boat, or die trying to escape it. The weapons that killed U-boats were primarily depth charges, though by mid-war Allied aircraft, surface ships with improved sonar, and new weapons like the Hedgehog also took a heavy toll. But the depth charge was the classic killer. And experiencing a depth charge attack was psychological torture. You would hear the destroyer above, the sound of its propellers transmitted through the water. Thump, 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 getting louder, getting closer. The hydrophone operator would track it. Call out bearings. The captain would order evasive maneuvers. Hard right. Change depth. Go silent. Cut all non-essential systems. No talking. No movement. Just sit there in the darkness and wait. And then the splashes. The sound of depth charges hitting the water. If you were at periscope depth, maybe 50 feet down, you might hear 5 or 6 splashes in quick succession. A pattern. The destroyer dropping them off the stern while moving at speed. And you would start counting. The depth charges sank at roughly 16 feet per second. If you were at 100 meters, that gave you maybe 20 seconds before detonation. 20 seconds to change course. Dive deeper. Try to get out of the kill zone. The explosion, when it came, was unlike anything else. A tremendous crack, like a giant hammer striking the hull. The entire boat shook. Light bulbs shattered. Equipment broke loose. Men were thrown off their feet. If the charge was close, really close, the sound was deafening. Your ears would ring for days. The shock wave would slam through the water and hit the pressure hull with tremendous force. The pressure hull of a U-boat could withstand anything except a depth charge exploding within 10 to 20 feet. Inside that range, the hull would rupture. Water would blast in under tremendous pressure. At 200 meters depth, the water pressure is nearly 300 pounds per square inch. If the hull breached at that depth, water would jet in like a cutting torch. Anyone in the path would be killed instantly. The compartment would flood in seconds. But even if the depth charges missed, even if they exploded 30 or 40 or 50 feet away, they still did damage. The shock waves would bend the hull, crack welds, spring leaks, damage machinery, knock out electrical systems, rupture pipes. Each attack degraded the boat a little more. Most U-boats that were sunk by depth charges did not die from a single lucky hit. They died from accumulated damage, attack after attack, hour after hour, until finally something critical failed, and the boat could no longer stay afloat. There are documented cases of U-boats surviving hundreds of depth charges. U-427 survived 678 depth charges in April 1945. 678, over many hours. The crew must have been near insanity by the end. The psychological impact of sitting in a steel tube while the ocean explodes around you, knowing that any one of those explosions could be the one that kills you, was devastating. Men broke down, vomited, lost control of their bladders. Some became catatonic, just sat there staring at nothing. Shell shock, combat fatigue, post-traumatic stress disorder. Whatever you call it, it was common among U-boat crews. And then there was the crush depth. If your boat was damaged and could not control its depth, it would sink. Past 230 meters, the safe limit. Past 250, where leaks would start. Past 280, where the hull groaned and popped from the pressure. And finally, past 300 meters, where the pressure hull would begin to fail. What happened when a U-boat went past crush depth depended on how it failed. If the hull breached suddenly, catastrophically, the water would explode inward. The pressure at 300 meters is roughly 30 atmospheres. That is 440 pounds per square inch. When water enters the boat at that pressure, it does not just flood in, it explodes. A jet of water moving at hundreds of miles per hour. Anything in its path is destroyed. Equipment, bulkheads, men. There is a phenomenon called diesel effect. If the air inside the submarine is compressed rapidly enough by incoming water, it heats up. Just like in a diesel engine. Compressing air generates heat. At 300 meters, with 30 atmospheres of pressure, the air inside the submarine could heat to temperatures high enough to cause combustion. Some accounts describe men being incinerated, rather than drowned when their submarines imploded at great depth. Flash of heat. Then darkness. Over in an instant. But not all hull failures were catastrophic. Sometimes the pressure hull developed cracks, leaks. Water would spray in under high pressure. The crew would try to plug the leaks. Stuff mattresses into the cracks. Use wooden wedges. Anything to slow the water. But at great depth, with tremendous pressure, you could not stop it. The water kept coming. The boat kept sinking. And eventually, when the pressure became too great, the bulkheads would fail, and the entire submarine would flood. If you were in a compartment that flooded, you had maybe seconds to escape. You had to swim to the hatch, open it, swim through into the next compartment, and seal the hatch behind you. But the water was rushing in. The current was fierce, and you were disoriented. In the dark, equipment floating around, bodies, debris. Most men did not make it out of flooding compartments. They drowned in the dark while the rest of the crew sealed the hatches to save the boat. There were cases where U-boat crews managed to surface after being depth-charged. The boat would blow its ballast tanks, use compressed air to force water out, rise to the surface. And when they broke through, battered and leaking but still afloat, they would find Allied warships waiting. Machine guns would rake the conning tower. The deck gun if they tried to man it. If they tried to surrender, sometimes they were taken prisoner. Sometimes they were machine-gunned in the water. It depended on the circumstances, on whether the Allied crew felt merciful, on whether there was time to rescue survivors, or whether other threats demanded attention. On April 17, 1943, U-175 was depth-charged by the Coast Guard cutter Spencer in the North Atlantic. The boat was damaged, could not dive. Commander August Bruns ordered the crew to abandon ship. 41 men scrambled out of the hatches. The Spencer closed in, guns firing. 13 German sailors were killed. The rest were rescued and became prisoners of war. U-175 sank. This was one of the lucky cases. Most of the crew survived, but only because the boat was on the surface when the attack happened. Compare that to what happened to countless other U-boats. Depth charged while submerged. No time to surface. The boat sinking. Hatches jammed. Pressure too great to open them even if you could reach them. And the crew trapped inside. Sitting in the dark as the water rose, as the air ran out, as the boat descended past crush depth and finally imploded, taking everyone with it to the bottom of the ocean. In one documented case from February 1944, a British hunter-killer group sank 5 German U-boats in 1 month, one by one. Hitler's submarines and their 50-man crews died in the deep. There were no survivors. 5 boats, 250 men, all dead. This was not unusual. This was the pattern. Month after month, year after year. U-boats going out on patrol and never coming home. There was one case that stands out for its particular horror. U-505, commanded by Kapitän Lieutenant Peter Zech. On October 24, 1943, the boat was depth-charged heavily. The attack went on for hours, charge after charge, close ones. The boat shook constantly. Crew members were injured, equipment failed, leaks sprouted, and Zech, the commander, broke. The psychological pressure was too much. In front of his crew, he drew his pistol and shot himself in the head. This was the only documented case of a U-boat commander committing suicide during a depth-charge attack. The executive officer took command and brought the boat back to port. But the incident shows the psychological toll these attacks took, even on experienced, trained officers. Some U-boats were lost in ways that were somehow even worse than depth charging. U-921, on May 24, 1944, was strafed by a Canadian Sunderland flying boat. The commander, Oberleutnant Wolfgang Loy, and 2 crewmen were wounded. As the submarine dived to escape, Loy managed to get the 2 wounded men below deck. Then he closed the hatch behind them, sacrificing himself, sealing himself outside so the boat could dive and survive. He drowned on the hull of his own submarine to save his crew. The boat made it back to port. Lou did not. These stories, these individual tragedies, they add up. 785 U-boats lost, 28,000 men dead, most of them young, early 20s, some teenagers. They joined the U-boat service because it was elite, prestigious. The pay was better, the food was better. And in the early war years, when U-boats were sinking Allied shipping with impunity during the happy time, it seemed like a good choice. But by 1943 and 44, when Allied anti-submarine warfare had become devastatingly effective, U-boat service was a death sentence. The men knew it. By mid-war, crews going out on patrol knew the odds. They had attended memorial services for friends who did not come back. They had seen the casualty lists. They knew that 72% would not survive the war. And still, they went. They climbed into those steel tubes, submerged, and sailed into the Atlantic knowing they would probably die there. Why did they do it? Duty, patriotism, the bonds of comradeship, fear of being labeled a coward, orders. All the usual reasons men go to war, but also a certain fatalism. If you were assigned to U-boats, you accepted that you would probably die. The only questions were when and how. Would it be quick? A catastrophic explosion that killed you before you knew what happened? Or slow? Trapped in a flooding compartment, drowning in the dark, while the ocean crushed your boat like a tin can? By the end of the war, in April and May 1945, over 150 U-boats were scuttled in northern German ports, 15 in Wilhelmshaven, 10 at Hamburg, 31 in Travemünde, 26 in Kiel, 56 in Flensburg alone. The crews destroyed their own boats rather than let them fall into Allied hands. And then they surrendered. The lucky ones, the survivors, the 28% who made it through. What really happened inside a sinking U-boat was worse than most people can imagine. The movies show submarines shaking during depth-charge attacks, lights flickering, men holding on, dramatic but controlled. The reality was chaos, terror, equipment breaking loose and smashing into crew members, toxic fumes from ruptured batteries, fires, flooding, men screaming, men praying, men dying. And if the boat actually sank, if it went down, there was usually no escape, no time, no way out. You rode it down into the depths, sat there in the dark as the hull groaned and creaked from the pressure, as leaks sprayed cold seawater, as the air pressure built up from the incoming water compressing what was left. Your ears would pop, your head would throb, you would gasp for breath as the air became toxic. And finally, when the hull could take no more, it would implode, and you would die, instantly if you were lucky. The pressure crushing you, the water obliterating you, erasing you from existence in a fraction of a second. That was the reality for U-boat crews. Not glory, not adventure, just fear and suffering and death in a steel coffin at the bottom of the ocean. 28,000 men, most of them barely old enough to vote. They died in the cold, dark depths of the Atlantic. Died fighting a war that Germany had already lost. Died because someone ordered them to go to sea in submarines, and they obeyed. We should remember them, not as enemies, not as Nazis, but as human beings, young men who served, who followed orders, who climbed into submarines knowing they probably would not come home. They were brave, they were terrified, and most of them died horrible deaths that no one should have to endure. That is the truth about U-boats. That is what really happened inside when they sank. Not the clean, quick deaths from movies, but slow, agonizing terror as the ocean crushed the life out of them. Remember that. Remember them. And remember what war really costs.